So, amen. Well, Todd's with us today, Tod Bolsinger. This is the second coming of Tod Bolsinger with this gathering. And today we have Tod talking to us about tempered resilience. And if you don't have a copy of the book, I would encourage you to get the book, pick it up. And the first book that we studied last time around was Canoeing the Mountains. And this is kind of a follow-up book, although Tod has written other books as well. And one of the things that strikes me in the middle of this book, for this group especially, is Tod would say, if I were a bishop, I would want to issue a decree that to lead alone is reckless and arrogant. It is foolish and dangerous to both self and others. To lead alone usually results in either a failure of nerve or a failure of heart, which is to squander the valuable time, energy, and commitment of organizations and followers. And I just want to say an amen to that. It's good to be a part of a tribe. It's good to be a part of a learning community. We all need to be supported in our efforts at leading. And this is one of the insights that Tod lifts up in this book. And I just want to applaud all of you for taking the time today to stretch your own learning, as well as to keep the connection going between ourselves across the life of American Baptist churches. So without any further ado, one other thing, please take a moment, make sure that for those of you that just came in, to put your name, your church, your ministry, what region you're coming from, make sure you put that in the chat box. And also along the way, if you have questions that you'd like to ask of Tod, please put that in the chat box as well. And Brian Johnson, my co-host, will be scanning through those and picking out questions. Sometimes the questions follow a similar theme, and we'll be organizing that and then pitching those to Tod along the way. We'll have several different times to be able to interact with Tod during the presentation. So Tod, I'll turn it over to you today. Welcome.
Thank you, Charles. Nice to be with all of you. It was amazing to watch all of you sign in from where you're from. I saw people from Connecticut to California. I saw somebody from Arcata, California. I was born in Arcata, California. That was the little town that my parents went to Arcata High School and I was born in. So it is really remarkable to me. One of the things that I so deeply appreciate about these kind of Zoom calls in a world where I've begun to appreciate them less and less because they seem to like to define our lives, is that it does allow us to do things like this, like in a relatively short amount of time with a relatively small amount of investment, we can actually do some peer learning together. And so this is part of what we will be doing in this time. I'm going to bring some reflections, some thoughts from out of the book Tempered Resilience that comes out of my experience of leading, working with leaders around the country. And along the way, I am going to pause a couple times. I'm going to ask you to do some reflection. A couple of times, I'm just going to let it go silent for about 30 seconds or a minute or so, not too long. We're not Episcopalians. And then ask you to do a little bit of self-reflection and then come back with some questions. And we'll just kind of use our time all the way to the end of the 90 minutes as interact with a little more interaction as we go. So I don't want this to just be a brain dump, but we'll start from there. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to jump in, and then we'll come back to we use the chat, and we'll come back and do some conversation as we go. So let me make sure I got this. So this theme it's based on the theme of tempered resilience. I say part one because you will have to do part two. Like there's your part in it that has to come later as you begin to apply this in your own life. So this is from Edwin Friedman. If you're familiar with Friedman's work, Failure of Nerve, Generation to Generation. He was a Jewish rabbi who also was a marriage and family therapist who used Bowenian family systems theory. He was asked the question about leaders who he worked with as a therapist and a consultant about what was their big challenge. And this is the way he described it. They had been so focused on the aches and pains in the system that they'd been thrown off course by the complaints. They'd stopped supplying vision or had burnt out fighting the resistance. They'd ceased to be the strength in the system. In short, they had forgotten to lead. What I want to draw your attention to in this moment is really an insight that I read in Friedman years ago, but only became true clear to me as I began to work with leaders more directly. For 27 years, I was a pastor in 2 different congregations, 10 years at Hollywood Presbyterian on their staff in a junior role, and then 17 years as a senior pastor. Taught in seminaries, wrote a couple of little books, asked to come back to Fuller Seminary to try to lead some work in theological education and trying to make some shifts in theological education in our seminary, and began working more and more with leaders around the country. What I want you to pay attention to is this phrase: they had been thrown off course by the complaints. What I think most of us have discovered during the pandemic is that the pandemic is terrible. COVID is horrible. Lives have been disrupted. But for us as pastors, the worst part of it is what it did to our people internally, what it did to us within our community, within our congregations. That when we found ourselves praying about the way in which we could make an impact to serve and care for our neighbors, we found our congregation resistant. When we talked about unity of purpose and vision, we found our congregation divided. When we started talking about trying to move more and more into making an impact for the sake of the gospel, where people are in need, we had more and more people come to us and ask us why we weren't doing more for them. This notion about the internal resistance being one of the most profound challenges, leadership challenges, that most of us didn't expect, is at the heart of a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. On March 13, 2020, I left a group of church planters in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I went through the Denver airport, and in the Denver airport, United Airlines handed me a Clorox wipe. It was the first time I was ever invited to wipe down my own seat. And I remember when they said, hey, because of this coronavirus thing, we want you to help us keep everybody safe by keeping the plane clean. And I remember thinking, they keep people safe at 30,000 feet every day. If they need my help, we're in big trouble. And I realized what a different world we were in that moment. It thrust us in that moment. It was Friday the 13th. By that Sunday, every church I knew was going online. They had a television ministry that they called Facebook Live. They were all adapting as quick as possible. I started calling my clients. Right now, in one way or another, we work with, between my consulting group and my center that I work with at the school, we work with about 60 different churches and church leaders. Started calling them to make sure they were okay, checking in on them. Almost everybody said the same thing. Oh, we're fine today, as long as we don't have to cancel Easter. We had no idea that we would be in this conversation now in lots of different levels and really different ways around the country, lots of different, uniquely different ways 2 years later. But what was the hardest part of all was been this internal resistance. Pause there for a second, hold that thought, and then go with me, if you will, to the Silicon Valley, where I was invited to come and address a group of Silicon Valley leaders who were Christians, who were going to help me with an initiative that I was doing for the seminary. I was invited to come to a Silicon Valley boardroom on one of those famous streets, where I was going to get some input on an initiative that we were doing for the seminary. We were working hard on trying to figure out changes we need to make in the seminary to continue to serve Christian leaders around the country. And when I was, one of my trustees heard me give a presentation to the board of trustees, he said, what you're talking about doing is doing something innovative in a very traditional institution that usually doesn't go well. Traditional institutions tend to reject innovation. Just if you ever want a case study this like Saturn car that General Motors introduced in the early 1990s as a way of competing with Japanese imports. By 1994, it was the 4th leading car in the country, and by 2010, they had sold it off for parts because traditional institutions tend to reject innovation. He looked at me and said, you could be the next Saturn car of Fuller Seminary. That's a good job security. So I flew to Silicon Valley to meet with a group of entrepreneurs who would try to coach me in how to bring innovation. And what they said to me was, hey, do us a favor, give us a pitch. This is the language we use, 10 minutes to tell us about your value proposition, about why this is so important and what you want to do and who you want to serve. And then we'll give you feedback. Pretend we're going to fund your initiative. We're not giving you any money, Todd, but we are going to give you some feedback. but pretend you want us to invest in it like it's a company. Why should we do it? And I got ready to hit the button and start my presentation. And what they said was, stop for just a second and tell us, who are you trying to serve again? I said, oh, we want to serve church leaders who need ongoing formation and theological education, but they don't need any more degrees and they don't want to take on any more debt. They said, okay, go. I did my 10-minute pitch. I finished it with a flourish. I felt good about what I had done. But I looked around the room and they were all smirking at me. They were just sitting there kind of giggling and kind of doing that side eye, kind of embarrassed for me thing. And I was trying to figure out what was going on. And finally, one of them looked at me and said, have you been doing that talk around the seminary a lot? I said, yeah, this is how I got here. I had to make a presentation to the board of trustees. I have to talk to the faculty. If I don't get the faculty on board, nothing goes good. I have to hire staff to come work, to go out of secure academic departments and come work with me, where I got to raise all the money. Like, oh yeah, I've been talking to people all over the seminary. They go, oh, that makes sense. Okay, now we get it. Because you just gave us a 10-minute pitch on why this is really, really important to help the seminary survive. Tod, nobody cares whether your institution survives. They only care if your institution cares about them. So you need to go out and talk to people out there in the world. You know, we would call them your customers. They all laughed, right? And find out what they care about. Nobody cares whether your institution survives. The hard part, of course, is that we care whether our institution survives, and the people in our institution care a lot. And if you say this to your church members, they're going to say, whoa, 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 wait a second, we get it, but what about us? We're the ones. We haven't had our worship services. We haven't had our programs. We haven't had the things that we want. What about us? We're the members here. And because that pressure is so intense, you heard me say, I got to talk to the trustees, talk to the faculty, talk to the staff. What I didn't say was talk to pastors, talk to church leaders, talk to people out in the world and ask them what they need. Because it didn't, what we found is that I was listening to those internal stakeholders. And the default behavior for most organizational leaders is to solve the problems for our organizations rather than change our organizations for meeting the needs of the world. And as soon as we nod and say, yes, it's not about us. It's about what God wants to do in the world. It's about our neighbor. That's what the guy reminded me. He said, Tod, you're a theology professor. Didn't Jesus say that you're supposed to love God and love your neighbor as yourself? It seems like you need to focus more on neighbor. Anytime the venture capitalist gives a Bible lesson to the theology professor, it's a bad day for the theology professor. But he was right. Because where our pressure comes is in our internal stakeholders. And as soon as we begin to move away from attending to them, to try to call them to the transformation needed in their lives for the sake of the world, resistance comes in. I say the two whispers changed my life. In Canoeing the Mountains, it was the whisper of a group of Methodist pastors in Portland, Maine, who said to us, how do we keep our churches from dying? When I wanted to talk about how their churches could get deeper. And the second one was when was a question that I would hear when I would travel around the country. I spent the better part of 5 years traveling 100,000 miles a year, talking to people about leading change in uncharted territory. And what would happen is I would get invited by some kind person like Charles. He invited me up there and I spent some time with them. And usually over lunch, right before I got back on a plane, somebody like Charles, who's in charge of the event, would say to me something like, hey, thanks very much. We'd like to get your slides. By the way, I'll tell you how to get these slides later. And by the way, I'm not sure we have anybody who can do this. I mean, this is really hard. And my first thought was, oh, I've got to do a better job of training people. That's what I do. I equip people for leadership. And what I heard over and over and over again was, no, we're not sure we have anybody who has the stomach to do this. Do you know how hard it is to disappoint your own people? Do you know how hard it is to face the resistance of people who want it to be about them? And you tell them it needs to be about something, about their neighbor, and they nod and then don't do it. One of my coaching clients said to me, Tod, I don't worry about whether I can learn to lead change. I worry about whether I could survive it. And so I want to do in our time together is talk about what it takes to be able to continue to lead this kind of change, this transformation in our own congregations, the transformation needed to be able to live out the mission of God in the world, and especially the transformation needed to face the resistance that we face. What it requires is resilience. And there's lots of different definitions of resilience and lots of good books out there right now. But let me tell you, this is my favorite definition, and I use this in the book, Resilience. Resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. Maintain core purpose and integrity. Now, if you know me, if you spend more than 10 minutes with me, you know that maintain is not a verb that gets me out of bed in the morning. I'm not a good maintain guy. I like to innovate or experiment or try new things or learn new things. But maintaining core purpose, that matters to me. Maintaining integrity, that matters to me. You see, resilience is about holding on to our core purpose, the reason we exist. And integrity is about holding on to the way we do it, that we do not want to compromise. And what we start to recognize is that when we are in dramatically changed circumstances, it's not just a matter of we getting tired or weak or wimpy, thrown off course by the complaints. It's that we can actually lose our core purpose, or we can sacrifice our integrity. Resilience is about something that important. So here's the first thing I want you to understand. Resilience is formed in the crucible of leadership. Resilience is not something that you can get before you're in the middle of it. You can take on some of the characteristics. We'll talk about that. You can learn some of the techniques. We're going to talk about that. But true resilience is formed when you're actually in the leadership challenge, which is one of the reasons why it is doubly challenging. And if you find yourself in that moment right now, what I want you to have is a bit of hope that this moment is the moment that God is using to form you for the sake of your mission and for the sake of your people. Where this starts is with the concept of sabotage. When I traveled around the country talking to people about leading off the map, leading in uncharted territory, leading what's called adaptively, what everybody wanted to talk about was the chapter on the book on sabotage. Everybody wanted to talk about it, no matter where I went. It makes sense because Ed Friedman, quoted earlier, said that he thought it was the most important aspect of leadership, the capacity of a leader to be prepared for, to be aware of, and to learn how to skillfully deal with sabotage. Maybe the most important aspect of leadership. It is literally the key to the kingdom, he said, Jewish rabbi, quoting Jesus to make a point to us. How do we think about sabotage? For Friedman, he said, if you're a leader, you need to expect sabotage. He went so far as to say that the important thing to remember about the phenomena of sabotage is that it is a systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. In other words, that experience of resistance that we're getting when we're trying to bring change is part and parcel of leading. It's normal, it's to be expected. He put it this way. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It's only having first brought about a change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. Let me help you think of it this way. I'm a Presbyterian, and we Presbyterians have a belief, a deep core fundamental belief, right down to our bones, that if you can have a properly called meeting and you can run that conversation with a proper process, like Robert's Rules of Order, and if everybody gets to talk in the way that they should and debate the way they should with reason and deep reflection, and you call for a vote and you get one vote more than the majority, you have Pentecost. Like it is like that is how the Holy Spirit falls upon us. This is, for Presbyterians, this is a big day. You get the votes, one vote more than the majority, you get to bring change. Here it comes, hallelujah. And what we get pretty good at because of that is getting the votes, having the debate, structuring the argument and the conversation, and then assuming that once we got the vote passed, motion carries, we now have change. What Friedman would say is the moment you get to that point, is the moment that the real task begins. Because it's only after having you first made the change, then the sabotage comes. And until you survive the sabotage that comes after initiating the change, after starting the new initiative, after getting people on board for the capital campaign, after starting the new evangelism motion, after beginning a process of welcoming refugees, after you have gotten everybody to agree that we're going to take steps for social justice, whatever the conversation is, whenever you've gotten people to agree, raise their hand and say, yes, we'll do it, we're in. Then the sabotage comes. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. So what we need to know in order to become more resilient leaders, first and foremost, is that sabotage is normal and it's natural and it's to be expected. That sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do, but the human things that anxious people do. Sabotage comes from our human anxiety, our natural, ordinary human anxiety. That when we get fearful about the future, we want the familiar. And we will stop anything to get back to what is familiar. If it's helpful, just sometimes I think of it this way. Remember that the root word for family and familiar are the same root word, which means that when you're in an unfamiliar place, you feel not just disoriented or confused, you feel unfamilied, you feel abandoned. And in that moment of anxious abandonment, you want to run home to mama. You want to get back to what is familiar, even if that thing that is familiar was slavery. This is exactly the experience that so many of us are having with our congregations today, and which has been part of the people of God from the beginning. Remember Moses? Remember the Red Sea, the greatest miracle that any humans would see until the resurrection, a miracle that 650,000 people experienced with their own eyes. Remember what it was like for them to be freed by Pharaoh after that horrible Passover night when Pharaoh said, finally, you can go, and 650,000 enslaved Hebrews were told they could go. God knows their hearts, it says in Exodus 13. Knows that if they run into their ancient foes, the Philistines, think about that for a second. Their foe that is 400, they've been in slavery for 400 years. Those Philistine stories are 4 centuries old and they're still haunting them. But if they run into their ancient foes, the Philistines, he says he knows they would go back. So he sends them another way and he sends them right into the cul-de-sac that is the Red Sea. And with the Red Sea on one side and Pharaoh's chariots coming down on them from the other side, because Pharaoh can do the math. And he figured out that 650,000 free laborers is going to change his gross domestic net product, and that he needs to change his economics by getting them back. So he sends his chariots, and there they are between the Red Sea and the chariots. And the people of God do what the people of God always do when they are in a terrible, horrible place. They stand up together, they raise their voices to the heavens, and they blame the leader. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians and die in the wilderness, Moses. This was your idea. This wasn't our idea. We wanted just some more straw for the bricks. We wanted a little time off to worship on Sundays, maybe a bit better lunch. You're the one who said freedom. This was your idea. You got us into this. See, now we're going to die. Thank you, Moses. Moses says, stand and see what the Lord will do. And the Lord does. And they parts the Red Sea. They go through on dry land. They end up on the other side. They see the chariots coming after them, and they watch the waters return, and they watch all of the Pharaoh's armies and chariots and chariot drivers dead on the beach, and they know they are free, and they break into song. So the people believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses, it says Exodus 14:31. And Exodus 15 is literally the songs. It's 2 praise songs. Moses leads a song, Miriam leads a song. They have a big worship service. It's exciting. And then they head to lunch. And it's over lunch, just like today, that all the problems start. Because when they start moving into lunch, they realize that they're having a picnic and they're going camping, and they're going to be in the wilderness, and now they start to grumble. 6 weeks. 6 weeks. 6 weeks after seeing the greatest miracle that any humans would see till the resurrection. 6 weeks after 650,000 of them saw this miracle. 6 weeks later, we see the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses. You know, Moses, slavery. Okay, they killed our children, yes, but we had leeks and onions for lunch. Maybe we should go back. 6 weeks, and they want the familiar. Moses stands firm. God meets them at that moment and delivers the manna, and they keep going forward. Sabotage. It's normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. And it's what happens after you've made a change. And then the sabotage comes. Moses survives this moment of sabotage. He does so by being really clear that he's going to depend upon God and calls upon God, and God meets their needs as God has said, promised that God would. But in Numbers chapter 11, they start grumbling again. And now they're grumbling because they want to return. And they want to return because they are tired of the miracle that God is doing every morning. They're tired of the manna. They're not hungry. They're just bored. And they just want something else. Oh, remember the flesh pots? Remember the leeks and onions? Oh, maybe we should go back. And this time, Moses gets mad. I mean, he's furious. He literally says to God, if you're going to leave me with these people, you can kill me now. Now, I don't know if you ever prayed that on a Sunday afternoon after coming back from leading a worship service or leading a church meeting or something, but I'll bet you at least once you thought to yourself, I could sell real estate. I could sell life insurance. I could teach biology. I always think I could do trail maintenance in the national parks. I could just pick up stray cigarette butts and tin cans and litter and move a rock or move a log and make sure the trails are good. Oh my gosh. I could do that by myself, never having to talk to another person again. What Friedman calls that first temptation is a failure of nerve. The failure of nerve is where we cave to the pressure of the anxiety of the group to return to the status quo. The failure of nerve is what happens when they say, we should go back. And you say, okay, I get it. Change is hard. We're making a lot of changes. We got a little bit of change fatigue. Maybe we should just stay right here. Maybe now we could go back and get a better deal from Pharaoh. Maybe now we'd understand. Maybe now we could get that straw. Maybe now we could get maybe even a whole day off. Maybe we can get a Sabbath day off. Let's go back and negotiate. And when we collude with the anxiety of the group to stop the transformation that God wants to have happen, Friedman calls that a failure of nerve. A failure of heart is where we become so angry at our people, so filled with discouragement, so raked with cynicism that it leads us to disconnect from our people. We find ourselves thinking like, what I just really need is a better congregation. What I really need is another people. Oh, what I really need is something else to do. Or what I really need to do is just stay away from these folks. And you can find the hardness in your heart. My friend Jimmy Miato is the president of Compassion International. And he said to me one time in a meeting, he said, Tod, the greatest problem with doing God's work is it can undo God's work in you. And that's what a lot of us end up feeling like. When I read the statistics about the Barna report that says that almost 40% of all pastors this last year, higher than 2020. 2021, people were like, okay, 2020 was bad, but 2021, I'm done. Almost 4 out of 10 pastors said, if I could do anything else, I would. When asked why they stayed in the ministry, most of them said, because I don't know how I'd feed my family. We all know ministry is a great calling. It's a horrible job. To do ministry as a job is really tough. And if you're under 45, that statistic is even higher. It's almost 50%. Many of us who have worked very hard to not succumb to a failure of nerve are having a failure of heart. We are getting tired and angry. I'd say that at the seminary, every one of our students shows up with post-traumatic church disorder. They got something where the church has hurt them, harmed them, disappointed them. Sabotage is often the reason for a change leader's either failure of nerve, failure of heart. Okay, let me have you take a moment. Here's 30 seconds. Take a deep breath and ask yourself the question, what am I more prone to? Am I a leader that's going to have a failure of nerve? Have I been having a failure of nerve? Am I tempted to one? Or am I a leader that's tempted to a failure of heart? And what do you think you need to be able to lead well at that moment? We're going to press on in a moment, and we're going to think about how to overcome the failure of nerve and failure of heart, how we develop what we call the tempered resilience to do so. But before we do, I want to pause, and especially if there's any questions or any thoughts at this moment that would be helpful. I'm going to even stop sharing my screen for a second so I can make sure I can see more faces. But if you've got to put something into chat, or if you want to send something to Brian, or Brian, if you yourself have some ideas about this, let's just take a moment and consider how this, if there's any questions or any responses to this so far, this place we're in.
Yeah, hi, this is Danny. I'm just wondering how you separate out the I guess I'd call this people who are doing sabotage and recognizing that, understanding that what they're doing is not evil. I get that, but how do you separate out what you need to do to win them over?
Yeah. So we'll talk. So in Canoeing the Mountains, I talk about how you respond to sabotage, and quite frankly, this was taught to me. This was one of the most helpful things I learned from Richard Blackburn of the Lombard Mennonite Peace Center. They basically have a way of thinking about it that goes like this: you have to start with a clear conviction. And that clear conviction is not something you just made up out of yourself. A clear conviction, to me, a missional conviction, is something that we discerned as a community that God has put before us. This is what, it wasn't just you saying, hey, I'm the pastor, follow me, or it's sabotage. That's not it. The clear conviction is really when we as a community, when we as a leadership team, when we have said, this is what God has called us to do or to be, here's the ministry that we are called to take on, here's the change we need to make. Then you start in that process, right? You make the change. And the sabotage comes. What he says is, you then stay calm. We'll talk more about this in a moment. You've got to manage your own reactivity. What most of us do at that moment is the sabotage so wrecks us that we then wreck the whole process. We get reactive. We get angry. We get mad. We get angry. We make it worse. Stay calm. Be able to focus on the mission, not the anger that's in the room. Stay connected. This is what's really hard. The failure of heart keeps us from staying connected to the very people who are sabotaging us. One of the parts we talk about in tempered resilience is we learn that attunement accelerates change. The experience of people feeling felt by us, loved, understood, even when they respond, when they react to us. When we move closer to people and we say to them, I understand how angry you are. It's the work we were all trained to do when we helped people go through grief as individuals. It's taking the grief work we all know how to do when we pastor people and applying it to a system or to a people. So stay calm, stay connected. And the last one, and the most important one, is stay the course. If this is a conviction that we are to do, we must continue to stay that. And if you start to pull back, waver, maybe we should go back and see if Pharaoh will negotiate a better deal, the whole thing falls apart. And so this is and there's more to the process, and we can talk more about that as you go. But thank you, Dan, for that. Yeah. And any other questions? Somebody put it here in the chat. Let me put a couple questions in the chat. So how do you discern the difference between resistance to change, unfamiliar, and spiritual war from the enemy that hates Christ and his mission? Well, Clayton, so here's an interesting part for me. I would tell you that I'm not always clear right away. Like, I don't know. because for me, they have the same effect. The effect is to stop the mission. Like this is somebody else asked the question one way. They asked the question like, how do you know, what's the difference between someone who just is raising a concern, like a legitimate concern, like we don't want to silence every voice and call it sabotage, right? So here's how you know. The status quo wants not to change. To say, we're going to stay here, we're not going to change, we're going to stay in this place, we're going to stay in slavery, or we're going to stay in the place where the people in power and privilege get to keep power and privilege. Whatever it is, the status quo is what is always sabotaging. It's sabotaging for the status quo. Satan's very happy for the status quo. The mission will not go forward. If he can't make you go back, at least I can get you fearful to stay here. So whatever it is, whether it's anxiety, whether it's spiritual warfare, whether it's good critique, the way we assess it is by asking the question, what is God calling us to do in the mission? So anybody who critiques, hey, Todd, we got a plan. We're in favor of our moving forward. We just aren't sure you've got the right strategy. That's a good conversation we can have amongst friends. Where we know that we're getting sabotage is when things want to go back to the status quo that we know we've been called to leave. And spiritual warfare for me can be used with really anxious people. I mean, one of the parts you see over and over again is how Satan uses the fear and anxiety of the people of God to stop the mission of God. And so I think that's either way, the way we think about it in that way is important. So Charles has a question. Church boards often lose nerve and or lose heart. What role do they play in assisting the leader to be strong in both heart and nerve? Well, thanks, Charles. Yeah, there's I would just give you a resource that it's not mine, but it's so helpful for me. The group, the Ministry Collaborative, there's a resource called Digging a Deeper Well by Mark Ramsey. And if you follow me on Facebook, I often quote them. They do a lot of work with board work. They do the best newsletter I know on board work. It's really quite remarkable. And they would often say that the most important work of a leader is to develop the capacity of its board. And this is the work. I mean, actually, the work I'm doing now in my own work is around spiritual formation. How do we start discipling people to have adaptive capacity and resilience? Because what we've done is we have discipled people to be, consumeristic and individualistic. So how do we shift our spiritual formation? And so one of the things to say is, I would say is adaptive leadership gives the work back to the people and it develops the capacity of your people, starting with your boards. So your boards have to be part of the mission. They got to see themselves not as overseers that keep you in check, but as partners who share the mission with you in a different role. So let me see if there's one more out there that we can capture, either in the chat or.
Yeah. Is there a difference between active sabotage or passive sabotage, or is sabotage? And if there is a difference, do you deal with both individuals the same way?
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. So what helped me about this language of sabotage is that it allowed me to identify that either passive or active is doing the same thing. It's trying to stop the transformation, right? Even this conversation, so the conversation I had in Silicon Valley, what I realized was, I have to tell you this, I went to Fuller Seminary as a guy who'd come from the church, not the ivory tower. Yes, you have a PhD, but you came from the church. Your job is to help bring the concerns of the church to the seminary. 3 years later, I'm talking like a seminary person. I'm talking like an insider because I'm like, what do you do? Like, a pickle is just a cucumber that's just been immersed in brine. And the brine of our culture is one of self-preservation. And so you start realizing that sabotage can come passive, it can come active. Whatever it is, though, however it comes, by naming it as sabotage, what you're able to do is say, this is normal, it's natural, it comes from anxiety, and it needs us to stay calm, stay connected, and stay the course, keep going. So however it comes to you, it's really interesting language. I'm not comfortable when I first heard sabotage, I was like, oh, that's such brutal language. And then I started talking to people and asked them how they experienced sabotage. And the way you experience it is pretty brutal. Good, good, well-hearted people who tell you they love you and they pray for you every day, and then will stop anything you're doing, right down to the point of making sure that you're no longer our pastor if you keep doing it. It's gut-wrenching. Let me say, Edmund has an interesting question about pastor self-sabotage. Let me keep going. We're going to address that one here in a moment, and we'll go. So let me go. I'll go back to my notes, and we'll keep going. We'll have another time to talk before we wrap up here. So we'll have a little bit longer time. So let me talk about how we respond to it. So I'll go back to sharing my screen. Take it from there. So let me take you to a place in history, August 28th, 1963. Some of you are very familiar with this date, I'm sure. 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. They came on church buses, most of them, from all around the country, and they came dressed in their Sunday best. And they came for a march for freedom and jobs. That's what the event was billed as. And they had speakers all day speak to them about the need they had to address the lack of civil rights for our African-American brothers and sisters in 1963. The speakers spoke all day. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer, sang 2 hymns. And when she finished her 2 hymns, Roger Mudd of CBS said, all the sermons in all the world couldn't have done as much as those 2 songs did right there for people. We could all go home today. And then they introduced Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the moral leader of our nation. And he stood up to give a speech that he worked on until 4 a.m. With his speechwriter, Clarence B. Jones. And he wanted a speech that was sober and intellectual and honest, but would not be accused of inflaming or inciting any passions that would cause any problems. And so what he did is he used a metaphor, and the metaphor was that of a bad check. He said the United States of America was built on a promise in the Declaration of Independence, and it was given a promissory note to its African-American citizens in the Emancipation Proclamation. But 100 years after that promissory note was given to our African-American brothers and sisters, it has come back insufficient funds. And because it has come back insufficient funds, it is time for the United States of America to make good on the promises that it gave to its people. What's powerful for me about that moment is that that speech didn't work. He was right in the middle of it. He had an experience where, like that some of us have had given a sermon, where all of a sudden you realize the joke didn't work, the line didn't land. He pauses for just a second. He begins to riff off script. And Mahalia Jackson behind him says, tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream. Clarence B. Jones is sitting behind him and says, these people don't know it, but they're about to go to church. And he launches into Isaiah 40. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made a plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. This is what he says to these people who have come from the South. These people who've come from all over the country, but especially to those who've come from the protests and the marches and the lunch counters and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. He says, because I believe that a day is going to come, because the scripture tells us so, that God is going to redeem this world down to the dirt. We go back to work. We go back to the protests and the lunch counters and the marches and the dogs and the hoses of the jail. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. What do you do when you're facing a mountain of despair? Resistance. What do you do when you're facing a 400-year-old mountain of despair? You don't blow it up with dynamite. You don't bash it with a sledgehammer, and you don't back down. You hew it, Dr. King says. You transform it. For those of us who are preachers, this is like a master class, right? This is parallelism. This is where you take 2 ideas and you link them together in such a way that they're way richer than they would have been separated. What do you do at this moment? You bring transformation. You transform that mountain of despair into stones of hope. I don't know about you, but I can't hear this passage without having 1 Peter ring in my ears. Come to him, a living stone, and let yourself as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God, a place where the glory of the Lord is seen, a place where the presence of God is found. What do you do with this mountain of despair? If you handle it well, if you hew it into stones of hope, this very place of despair can become the place where the presence of God is seen in the world. But how do we become a tool that can hew? I mean, a tool that can hew is different than a sledgehammer, right? It's a tempered tool. It's more like a chisel that has the strength to handle the stone and has the flexibility to shape it and carve it into stones of hope. That transforming tool is a tempered tool. Resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. How do you find the core purpose? How do you hold on to the integrity when you are facing the mountain of despair of sabotage? By being a tempered tool. How do we find the resilience to face resistance? How do we find the resilience to overcome a failure of nerve and a failure of heart? It's not found, it's formed. Resilience is formed in the crucible of leadership. And that's the critical question for us. That's the insight that I want you to leave here with, is that in the middle of the very challenge you're facing, if we can approach it as a formation challenge, it can form us into the very tool that can bring stones of hope out of our mountains of despair. I call this tempered resilience. Tempered resilience is a grounded identity and resilient character that is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. It's a process, in other words, and it's a process that happens in the crucible of leadership. I won't go into great depths with this today. You can get the book if you want. There's lots of things you can do, but I'd like to at least give you some concepts to think about that would help you think about your own formational process of a leader, especially a leader as you are leading right now in this moment, and particularly if you find yourself facing resistance and sabotage. Tempered resilience. It starts for me, and it started for me in a blacksmithing class. When I saw that quote from Dr. King about tools, about hewing, and I thought about tools that can hew, and I thought about tempered tools, I thought, I need to find out something about blacksmiths and how tempered tools are made. And so I discovered that there is an urban blacksmithing class here in Los Angeles, California. It's in a area of the city. There has not been a horse there in 100 years, but there are blacksmiths, and there are these artisan blacksmiths. And I signed up for a class. I showed up one day with my wife, who's an artist and who's used to doing this kind of stuff. She does encaustic painting with blow torches and stuff. I'm the one who's not very creative at anything. We showed up. I'm wearing jeans and a t-shirt. I walk in the room, and everything in this room can kill you. Like, they're just like, everything in this room, this is like serious work is done in this room. And they tell you that by handing you a clipboard where you sign your name on a line that says you understand that everything in this room can kill you, or it can at least take away a finger or an eye. And then they give you ear protection. That's it, earplugs. I thought I was gonna get like chain mail or leather gloves or a helmet or something. Nope, ear protection. And wearing a t-shirt and jeans and ear protection, that's it. Not even had a full safety lecture yet. They took the tongs and they gave me a pair of tongs, they gave me a piece of steel, and they told me to put the steel into the fire, and I was blacksmithing. Like, I'm in the middle of this thing before I even know what I'm doing. Like I find myself just totally overwhelmed in it. And at that moment, I realized, oh, this is the perfect metaphor for leadership. Because the first part of the process is entering the work. You can't make a tempered tool from outside the shop. And this is exactly what we have to understand as leaders. Leaders are formed in the leading. They're formed in the crucible of leadership. You can't prepare for it ahead of time nearly enough. I have to just say this always with a little bit of a smirk, that is, you can't become a leader by hearing a lecture, reading a book, doing a workshop, taking a class. Says the guy who does lectures, writes books, gives workshops, and teaches classes. They can get you tools or techniques, but you're not going to be leading till you're in it, which is one of the reasons why so much of our work now is working with leaders in the middle of leading. Leaders are formed in the leading. And the other part about this that's so important to remember is you become a leader right after you were good at something that was not leading. Like that was the reason you got promoted to being a leader, pastor or leader, district leader, whatever, is that right before you did something really, really well. I mean, think about this. They make people pastors because they're good at preaching, as if somehow nailing 3 points in a poem is the same as leading a people. And what you realize is your competence at one level leaves you vulnerable at the next. So you have to be willing to then enter into the experience of transformation right after you've been given the mantle. This is the process that you see here all the time in what we call tempered resilience. It's a process of heating and holding and hammering and quenching. A process just like the steel goes through repetitively, where it's heated, held on the anvil, hammered into place, into shape, and with strength, quenched or tempered in such a way that the tempering happens in that process of releasing of the stress from the steel. Heating, holding, hammering, quenching, reflection, relationships, practices, a rule of life, slow release in a rhythm of leading and not leading. So where do we start? In the fire. The blacksmithing instructor had basically given us steel. We put it in the fire. We were there in the middle of it. He did finish the safety lecture, but while he was lecturing away and we were in the middle of it, he said about halfway through, he just stopped and said, hey, reach in with the tongs and pull out the steel for a minute. Notice it's the same character and the same consistency as it was just a few minutes ago. It just happens to be 700 degrees right now. It'll burn the skin off your hands. But at this stage, you can't make it into anything. It's just dangerous. My dad loved to talk about leadership. He was a coach and a teacher. He used to quote Harry Truman, if you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. What I need you to know is if you want to become a resilient leader, the kitchen ain't hot enough. Leadership experiences alone aren't hot enough. Your experience of resistance isn't hot enough. The sabotage isn't hot enough. What you actually have to do is put yourself back into the fire of deep, vulnerable self-reflection while you're in the middle of the leadership process. You got to allow yourself to feel the vulnerability of self-reflection. John Dewey said, you don't learn by experiences, you learn by reflecting on experiences. And that's the first skill set for the really good resilient leader, is the capacity toward vulnerable self-reflection. Self-reflection that allows you to experience and know the places where you know you need shaping and changing and help. Maybe it's because when you got that sabotage, you realized you're not able to stay calm. You do get defensive. You do get angry. You do start lashing out at people. Maybe it's because when you experience the sabotage, you can't stay connected to people. You realize that you cut them off. You don't want to be around them. You're mad at them. Or maybe you just smile at them like my friends in Texas taught me. You can do whatever you want as long as you say, bless his heart. And maybe we find ourselves passive aggressively pulling away. Maybe it's because you know you can't stay the course. You're going to cave. You've had a failure of nerve so many times, and you've said it's just about your being pastoral rather than being a leader. Even though in the Bible, shepherds are leaders. So what do? You reflect on those experiences. The danger of being a 700-degree leader is that so many of us have been told, well, what we need to do is say, of course, it's hard, it's difficult, but look, notice, doesn't bother me. I'm fine. Ask me if I got any problems. No, I'm fine. I'm completely fine. I'm good. No, it's good. I'm the same character, the same consistency. I look exactly the same. It hasn't affected me. This is why I'm such a good leader. You should trust me. We say right until the leader blows up. 700-degree leaders are dangerous. And the steel needs to go from 700 degrees to 2000 degrees. It needs to go from being hard and gray to being soft and bright orange, red, ready to receive the shaping. I don't often make statements that are, hey, to be a leader, you have to do this. There's very few like hard and fast statements for me. But what I've realized is I don't believe it's possible to become resilient as a leader, to have tempered resilience, unless you first have the capacity to deep, vulnerable self-reflection. During the fall, I was fired by a megachurch pastor because I stood in front of his board and I said that you guys are going to have to learn how to deal with failure. One of your staff members told me about trying to plant one of your new churches and how he felt like a failure because he didn't know what to do and he couldn't replicate what the pastor who's a genius was able to do. And so he's sitting here stewing in that. And we've got to create an environment where he can not only acknowledge his failure, but we can come along and we can learn from the failures. And when I finished, the pastor got up and basically did an entire thing about how he didn't believe this was failure. He didn't believe we should talk about failure. And he didn't think that failure was even appropriate for people in God's kingdom. And 2 days later, he fired me for saying the word failure in front of his board. If you can't come to grips with your failures, your losses, your insecurities, your need to change and grow, you'll never be able to be shaped into the tool you need to be. Dr. King is our model for this. If you know the story, you know that in the middle of the Montgomery bus boycott, where he was called to be the leader, mostly because he had a sanctuary that was big enough to handle the crowd. They wanted to meet in his church and they understood how powerful he was as a leader. And so they asked him to not only welcome the church, the group to meet in his church, but to become the leader. And he said yes to it. And within a few weeks, he found himself praying in the middle of the night and saying, God, if I could get out of this thing without people thinking I was a coward, I would quit today. And God met him in that moment and said, Martin Luther, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. I know you. I'll be with you. And he said over and over again throughout the civil rights movement, he came back to that day over and over again, assured that God was going to be with him, including the day that he was in Memphis and stood before a group of people and said, I've seen the promised land from the mountaintop and I may not get there with you. And the next day, an assassin's bullet took him. Heeding, vulnerable self-reflection. It all starts in that capacity to your own self-reflection. So the instructor looked at us and said, okay, so now look in there. Notice that the steel is now not gray, but orange. It's already beginning to change consistency. Now it's ready. It's 2000 degrees. Reach in with the steel and pull it out. And when you pull it out, you notice that gravity makes it bend. This doesn't feel like something that can face a mountain of despair. It's just gravity makes it bend. It's just sitting there. He goes, don't walk it around the shop. It's dangerous. Don't twist it into shape. Don't hit it with a hammer. It'll explode. Put it on the anvil. The center of the experience is the anvil. The anvil is where the shaping takes place. And the anvil, the only safe place for something that's hot is on an anvil. And for a leader, the anvil is where we find our relationships. Vulnerable leadership requires relational security. The vulnerability of relationships requires this. Vulnerability of leadership requires the security of relationships. And really, quite frankly, this is the next place that I want you to do a moment of gut check. I want you to listen to this and ask yourself about your own relationships. Because what we know from so many statistics and so many studies that has only become worse during the pandemic is that most leaders feel deeply alone. And the higher up you get in an organization, the further up you get into leadership, the more alone you feel. And most of us think it's supposed to be that way. It's lonely at the top, they tell us. But what we've discovered is what you actually need is the more resistance you're facing, the more relationships you need. So think of it as the anvil, the thick, heavy anvil that has your name on it, that you get to, that holds you. This is where the shaping is done. And think about your relationships. I think about them in 3 categories for me. I think that my anvil needs to be made up of partners, mentors, and friends. Partners are those who care more about the mission than they care about me. That's how I know they're my partner. They're the people who, if I stopped doing it, they'd keep doing it. They would just get new partners. If I'm said I'm called to something else, they'd keep going. They are more committed to the mission than they are to me. They might be people I have dear relationships with. I've had great partners who I love deeply. But how I know they're a partner is they care more about the mission than they care about me. My friends are the people who care more about me than they care about the mission. My friends are the people who say stuff to me all the time, like, hey, Todd, hey, how's your work going? Great. I'll say, hey, they heard you got a new book out. I'll say, yes, you want to read it? And they go, no, no. I'm not interested in that leadership stuff. I care about you. Congratulations on having a book out. I know you worked hard. You want to go fishing? On a hike? How's your wife? How are you? Don't confuse the two. Very often, one of the great parts about ministry is that we have deep relationships. I said ministry is both beautiful and difficult because it's a family business. We have inherent relationships with people and we have a mission we're called to. But know the difference between the people who are primarily your partners and primarily your friends. And don't confuse them. I learned this from one of my friends who I asked him. He's an older guy. He's about 12 years older than I am. He was raising teenagers when I had little kids. His kids were getting married when mine were teenagers. Today, he's got grandchildren and my kids are getting married, that kind of thing. He's been a great friend. And one day we were out on a hike together and I said to him, look, you're a well-respected businessman, a deep Christian. Your family's loved. You're like the biggest source of wisdom in my life. I'd love you to come on our board. And he looked at me and he said, no. Todd, I actually know that what you need on the board is people who will really be good partners for you, care about our church. I love our church, but the truth of the matter is if push came to shove, I would choose you over the church every single time. And that's bad for the church. Don't confuse the two. You know you have a toxic system when everybody who is on the board or who is on the staff is loyal to the pastor. Loyalty to a person, not fidelity to a mission, is a sign of dysfunction. Partners care more about the mission than they care about you. Friends care about you more than they care about the mission. My mentors, they're people who care about me for the sake of the mission. These are the people, this mentors is the category where I put some people are actual mentors, mentoring relationships. Some of them are therapists or spiritual directors or coaches. Anybody who you go to and you say, I need you to help me be my best so that I can be able to live out what God's called me to do. Be a Christian, a parent, a pastor, a leader. In my own life, this is why our leadership company, you'll notice, is called A.E. Sloan Leadership. It's named after Alan Enid Sloan of Alburnett, Iowa, who when I was 68 years old, Al was on the search committee that called me to become to be the pastor of the church. And he told me a few months later that he and Enid prayed long before they knew who I was. And they prayed and they said, if God puts me on the search committee, then we believe that our calling will be to support the new pastor and the pastor's family for the rest of our lives, to do whatever we could to help sure that they have a great ministry and a great life. Think about that for a second. It probably chokes you up. It does me. They knew we needed to thrive as a family for the church to thrive. And they gave themselves to us. And they did in so many ways. Al was a president of a real estate company. He taught me how to be a leader. Enid was a spiritual director and they prayed for us. When Beth and I were in a place in our marriage where I was working so many hours that I was beginning to pull away from the family in ways that I shouldn't, she came to me and said, we need you not to be out so many nights and you and I need to be connected. And Al and Enid stepped up and gave us a date night every week for years. We couldn't afford a babysitter every week, but we would sit on a bench, we'd eat some frozen yogurt, we'd talk and catch up. And we wouldn't go home until they put our daughter Allie to bed because we fought every night over putting Allie to bed. And I didn't want to fight on a date night. They were the anvil that held us. They were mentors for us. Today, our company is called A.E. Sloan Leadership, and our purpose is to help faith leaders thrive as change leaders the way they helped us. Charles heard the line that I often say, which is that if I were a bishop, and I had spiritual authority over you, I would want you to know that I think it is clergy malpractice. It is leadership malpractice to try to lead alone. To lead without mentors, spiritual directors, therapists, coaches. And the most important thing we know about that experience is to have that experience of relationship requires that you show up oozy. You show up at 2000 degrees. You don't show up trying to impress the person. You don't show up at 700 degrees. Nothing can happen at 700 degrees. You put yourself on the anvil. You lay yourself down vulnerably in front of people that you trust. You let them hold you. And that's where the shaping begins. So let me just say briefly about these last 2 points, and then we'll have some conversation. Sitting there in the blacksmithing shop, I found myself so excited when I finally was able to start shaping the tool. I grabbed a hammer and I just started wailing on it. I was pounding away. It's just so excited to be making this thing into a tool that I was going to use. And the guy walks up to me, the instructor, and he puts his hands on my shoulder and he goes, "Todd, you're going to blow out your rotator cuff swinging like that. That hammer is heavy. Just let the hammer do the work. Lift it up, let it fall. Lift it up, let it fall." The hammers that shape us, when you're hammering steel, it shapes you into the tool you need to be, and it puts stress into the steel. Hammering it together hammers the molecules together, and it creates the strength. With every blow of the hammer, it's getting shaped and strengthened. And the thing you have to do is let the hammer do that work, shaping and strengthening. It's adding stress to the steel as it shapes it. That's why the third section of tempered resilience is that reflection, heat, relationships, that is the holding, and the hammer are your spiritual practices. The practices that you take on specifically at this stage of your life so that you can be a resilient leader. And for many of us, our spiritual practices are practices that have helped us, that got us this far. They've been great for us, but they don't shape us for the task we're in. And what we need to do is rethink our spiritual practices. I won't go into great detail with this, but I'd love for you just to spend some time. I encourage you to go home and just think about, what are the spiritual practices that you initially were taught? Maybe you didn't even call them that, right? Your parents taught you how to pray or say your prayers before you went to bed at night. I was a teenager when I started following Jesus, and I literally had someone give me a Bible and say, "Look, you need to read the Bible every day. You need to pray every day. You need to go to church every week." Those basic spiritual practices took me a long way. But when I became a pastor and I needed to preach the scriptures, I needed more than a little Bible every day. I needed hours and hours of Bible every week. And my prayer life changed. It wasn't enough just for me to pray my prayer list about my own concerns. I had to learn how to intercede for my congregation. How do your spiritual practices change because of your calling and ministry? And how have they changed over the years? And how do you need them to change today in order to become a more resilient leader? What practices do you need in your life that will shape you in this way? For 27 years, I was a preaching, teaching pastor. I did a lot of deep study of scripture. Today, I preach about 4 sermons a year, and they're all pretty good. They're usually the same sermon. So what's the role of scripture in my life today, as I'm now more of an executive coach, as I'm a consultant, as I work with organizational leaders? I need more discernment. I need less speaking, more listening. I need more leading of learning rather than bringing solutions. I used to say I was really good at creating strategic plans, but in a rapidly changing world, I've got to be better at teaching people how to think strategically about ever-changing plans. I got to think more innovatively, and I need to be shaped in new ways for that. Stress makes a leader when it's focused on a particular purpose. And for spiritual practices for a leader, forge strength and character that has the resilience to overcome or resist a failure of nerve or overcome a failure of heart, if our spiritual practices are hammering us for the work we need. And it's worth thinking through the changes we might want to make to be able to make that happen. And lastly, the tempering process isn't finished until it starts being cooled. I used to think that what you did when you finished a tool is that you plunged into the water. It's great. We're done. No. A tempered tool has to be cooled in a very particular way. A rhythm of slow cooling. What I call a rhythm of leading and not leading. You see, if you keep pounding the steel, you keep adding stress to it. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And if you take that tool with that stress in it and you start using that tool, you keep adding stress to it. And after a while, adding stress and stress and stress and stress, that tool becomes so hard and then passes over hard to brittle, and it breaks. Blacksmith said to me, I can keep pounding the steel until I break it, because it adds so much stress that it ultimately crumbles. And that's what we're watching with leaders all over the country today. The stress of doing work over and over and over again until they break. And so when we talk about a rhythm of leading and not leading, I'm not talking about something that you take on a sabbatical every 7 years, though if you can get one, do one. And I'm not just talking about having like a Sabbath every week, though we need one. I'm talking about having a rhythm where there are places in your life where you lead, and there are regular places of your life where you don't lead, so that you can release the stress in your life. I learned this from an older pastor. I was doing this presentation a couple of years ago now, outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and gave this presentation, and a pastor said to me, "Hey, I'm so glad to hear you talk about mining and tools and blacksmithing." He said, "I was a miner in West Virginia before I was a pastor some 40 years ago. And you know, when you're a miner, they give you a pickaxe and and at the end of the day, you're not allowed to go home until you take that pick back to the forge and you heat it up again. And then you have to let it slowly cool down. And you got to heat it up again. Let it slowly cool down. And you heat it up, and while it's cooling, you clean it and you file it and stuff. But what you're really looking for is for it to finally cool down enough until there's a blue line that goes right down the middle of the steel. When that steel turns blue, you know it's tempered. It has released the stress that was built up over hitting it on rock all day. And you do it every day. Carl Sandburg has a set of poems. One of them is called Laughing Blue Steel, because the kind of tool that's needed for a mining or for chiseling is tempered blue. What do you have as a rhythm of release in your own life? What is the slow release of leadership responsibilities that you can take on regularly? Is it exercise? Is it art? I cook my wife dinner every night. She's an artist. Part of the reason I cook her dinner is that every single night I end the day, after people sometimes have been mad at me all day, with someone going, "Thank you, that's delicious." Just to see her smiling face, and for me to eat that meal, that just does something for me every day. Regularly, at least once a quarter, I try to get up into the mountains. Every week, I try to walk outside someplace. I got a place in the mountains that I try to go very regularly. Man, I'm not changing anything. I'm just preserving the beauty of that nature and enjoying every bit of this thing that doesn't need me. Those mountains remind me that God's been at work for centuries, and they don't need me to do anything but not screw it up. What are the things of slow release of leadership responsibility in your own life? I'll give you one last illustration and then I'll close and we'll talk about this a bit. After 27 years of being a pastor, I finally got to worship with my wife. It was after 27 years of my getting to church early, her coming later. We had a 9:30 service. She came to the 11. The only problem was that service started at 10:45. Is that every single week we'd have a conversation about the fact that she showed up late every single week. And after a while, I told her, look, it bothered me, but there's nothing I could do about it. But now we were going to church together, and I said to her, look, I don't like being late to church. I think the people have worked hard. I want to be there for the call to worship. The band has done their work. The pastor's done stuff. Let's get there on time. And she said, look, we can get there, but I don't want to be stressed in the morning. And it's the most important thing is that we go together and we'll just get there. Let's not make it stressful. Let's go. And I'm like, yeah, but I want to be on time. And after a while, we were stressful. Every Sunday morning, we were stressing because we're running late and she's running late and I'm mad and I want to be there on time and I feel like we're being rude and we're just having this conflict every Sunday morning. Finally, one week, she's driving. She pulls up in front of the church. She goes, you're only a minute late. You go. You don't be late. I'll be there in a minute. And I want to hear about it. And I get out and I go sit in the pew and I'm waiting for her to come in and I'm stewing now. And I'm having this moment like, okay, it's now going to happen. We need to have this conversation. This has gone far enough. And a young couple comes and sits down next to me. And when she gets there a couple minutes later, she has to step over them. And I look at them and said, I'm so sorry. She's always late. And I'm just getting totally prepared for like, this is going to happen. And in my head, I'm like, I am so tired of her being rude. I feel like we're not honoring God. I feel like we should be here on time. And I feel like this is just not a good thing that honors the pastor. And I felt like God said to me, you know, you don't need to be on time. You're not in charge here. For a lot of years, you were in charge. It didn't start till you started it. But now it doesn't need you to be here. And I'm giving you this amazing gift that you get to worship with your wife. And you're missing it because you think this is about you. This is free. This is my gift to you. So now I am committed as a spiritual practice to being late to church every week. As a reminder that I'm not in charge there. I'm not the consultant. I'm not the pastor. I'm not the leader. And when I walk in a couple minutes late, I said to the pastor, just take this as I trust you and I know that you're doing your job and that I need everything that I can get and that we need to come here together. And my pastor laughs, and every single time he winks at me when I walk in just a couple minutes late. What are the spiritual practices that you have in your own life? And what do you need? Reflection, relationships, a rule of life, a rhythm of leading and not leading. And we'll take some questions, and we've got about 10 more minutes or so, but oftentimes I will give this set of prompts to people, but you can use whatever prompts you want. And while you're doing that, I'll just leave this up on the screen for a bit. This will give you a chance. If you'd like to get the slides, you can just use the QR code. I think it works on your screen. If you'd like to hear more, you can just take a screenshot of this whole screen and you can hear more about the resources and stuff we have available to you. But if you use this QR code, you'll be able to actually get the slides from the presentation and our kind of our greatest hits. But while that's up there, why don't we just take some more questions and kind of take it from there. So what do we have here? Somebody asked, here's the first question. What are some of the behaviors you see in a 700-degree leader? Thank you. At 700 degrees, what I really see, the biggest thing I see in a 700-degree leader is your tendency to want to fake it till you make it. I want to believe that I need to appear stronger than I am in order for people to follow me. And that tendency to fake it rather than be vulnerable is one of the things that becomes dangerous for us. So vulnerability and your capacity to acknowledge your need before God. I mean, it really is. It's search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, right? Acknowledging that there's hurtful ways in me. There's things I will do that'll be wrong. I need, if I could get out of this thing without being a coward, I'd get out of it too. And so partly when you find yourself faking it, trying hard not to let them see you sweat, then you find yourself in a place where very likely you are in danger of hurting people, instead of being able to be at least honest before God and before people that you trust in safe environments to be able to do so. In light of your learning, somebody asked, how would your self-leadership look different if you were pastoring today? Well, not too much different, to be honest. This is where I spend my day. I mean, I spend my day with leaders today. I think the single biggest difference that I would make is I would spend more time working hard to be as clear as possible. I was really shaped by Brene Brown saying, clear is kind. And I often believe because I'm an Enneagram 8, I kind of have a little bit of a strong personality. I've often been told that, I can be a little bull in a china shop. But what I realized is what it did is it made me become less clear. So to be able to say to people, hey, this is going to be hard. We're going to work on this thing that's going to be hard. We're going to need to pull together. We've got a hard decision to make. When I work with groups on adaptive change, I've got to often teach them how to name issues so we can navigate issues. If you can't name them, you can't navigate them. And so very often we don't even name stuff that we need to. Like we need to name the fact that, I'm spending more time focusing on the faculty than on the people we're trying to serve. I had to name that to be able to navigate that. So I think today, compared to where I was when I was younger, I would try to be clearer. I'll pull this down so I can see some faces. Is there any other questions or stuff that you have here in our last few minutes? I know it's a lot.
Hey Todd, this is Sam. Very helpful for the slides and the illustrations are really great. So I have a question. So can you describe some of the cooling mechanisms at the end you mentioned, right? So when the iron is ready, when do we say that it's ready? And when can we say, like, okay, ready to go,
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, what I recognize is what I need in my own life. When I think about the rhythm of leading and not leading, one of the things I do need is I absolutely need to be in worship when I'm not leading. Like, I need to remind myself when I get asked to preach, when I get asked to lead and do stuff, I still get asked to do a bunch of that. This isn't the same. I need to be in places where literally I am open before the Lord, confessing my sins with my brothers and sisters, being reminded that I am part of a church. It's really important. So being in a church body is really important to me. And it's become more important during COVID because I can find myself like everybody else. We've been doing stuff online, trying to stay connected. And I get to visit. I mean, I work with churches all over the country. I'm often traveling. So a church home is really important to me, a sense of community. Being really clear on the difference between my partners and my friends. Like, as I get older, I need more time with my friends. I need friends who can, that really I knew care about me. And that friendship is hard to maintain over time. And so we've worked really hard to maintain deep friendships. And for me, time in nature. I mean, I know that nothing revives my soul like being immersed in nature. So I just do a lot of time outside, and my family even jokes with me about it. They'll often tell me, Dad, you need to go. You need to go outside. You need to go play outside. I'm like a 5-year-old boy who's got too much energy. Like, go play outside. Right. So knowing, and what it mostly takes is knowing the rhythm. For me, figuring out that my wife, because she's an artist, I tend to work in the morning. She tends to work in the evenings. And when she said to me, would you be willing to make dinner? At first I was like, that's just one more thing I need to do. And I started realizing, oh no, this is actually like one of the best parts of my day. It's because I get to actually do something that is technical, that I can follow a recipe. I can please somebody. Like, I'm not disappointing anybody. Even if it's a bad meal, they're grateful. Like, there's things like this I need in my life that just restore me. So they'll be different for different people, but these have become really, really important for me.
Hey, Todd, I'll jump in here.
Thanks, Charles.
My poor wife would probably starve if I went that route, but good for you. I'm impressed. Hey, since we're kind of a whole tribe of people here, mostly American Baptists, and I think a good number of us would say our denomination is deeply in need of spiritual renewal and recommitment to spreading the good news of Jesus Christ in this new world that we're in. Any challenge to us or encouragement or word that would help us as a group, as a tribe, persist in following Jesus more faithfully as a group? I know you've worked with the Presbyterians, and perhaps a word to us as a denominational group.
Charles, thank you. I'll just tell you this part. One of the things that I get to work with people across the spectrum. It's like one of the incredible joys after 27 years of a deep dive in the community. I'm a deep dive kind of guy. Like, my first book was on Christian community. My doctoral work was on the spiritual formation of Christian community. So I'm a deep dive guy. But the last 10 years of my life, I've been seeing the breadth of the church. I mean, it's breadth. I literally work with people across the theological spectrum. I work with multiple types of Baptists, 3 different types of Presbyterians, 2 different types of Lutherans. It's about to be 2 different types of Methodists. It's just, we are across the spectrum. I mean, I worked with a group of Roman Catholic missionaries doing church planting in Appalachia. I've worked with the Salvation Army. I work with the Vineyard. I talk to people who don't talk to each other.
Yeah.
And part of what I realized is one of the things we actually need at this moment is to realize that the more we are focused on the mission, like the pain points of the world, the places where each of our individual churches that are different, that need to be different, that need to celebrate the charism and the gift. Like I go to a church now that I couldn't pastor. It's a church of about 200. And I always pastor larger churches and my pastor, man, he writes handwritten notes to everybody. He's like a great pastor. And I love being part of a church that's about 200 people. It's so good for me. I couldn't pastor it. But I know that I need to be part of seeing that the mission of God is bigger than me. And that what I would call people to think is the mission wins every time. Not me, not my tribe, not the initials on the door. I need to be shaped for the mission of God in the world. when we work with folks, we talk about how your charism, your unique gift,
Mm.
applies uniquely to the different places of pain in the world, and that will cause you to be transformed. So I would say keep recognizing the mission is bigger than any of us. And I'd say one last thing. I'll just say this. There's a story. It's an apocryphal story. I'm trying to find the resources, the research for it. I haven't found it, but I was told it in seminary, and I've reminded it ever since. It feels dramatic, but especially today, in light of what's happening in Ukraine, I think about this. In the Polish ghettos in World War II, when the Nazis were coming, the Jewish grandmothers committed themselves to teaching the Hebrew alphabet to their grandchildren. You think, my gosh, they're in the middle of a crisis. Why teach the alphabet? The reason why they said it is because if they know the Hebrew alphabet, they'll find the Torah. And if they find the Torah, someday they'll find God. What I want to say is no matter what we do, we've got to do the little bit. What is the little bit we can do to help our congregation continue to be part of God's mission in the world? What's the Hebrew alphabet I need to teach today so that someday people might find our congregation and find God again in this world? That's what I focus on a lot.
Great. Good word. Good word. We have 1 minute left, and it's probably enough. It's been an hour and a half. Thank you, everybody, for joining the Zoom meeting today. Thank you so much, Todd. It's been excellent. This has been recorded, and after it's recorded and we have an opportunity to edit it, we'll make it available to you, as well as the slides from today's presentations. I would remind you, too, to pick up Todd's books and take advantage of that connection point there to the online resources he's made available. God bless everybody. Have a great day. God bless you, Todd.
Thank you, Charles.